Welcome back. Before moving on to Chapter 2, I'm going to talk about another section of Chapter 1 that may be of interest to you for your discussion questions, and that's the 5 ages that are also provided there in Chapter 1. This is also helpful for you historically to be able to place Greek culture, Greek mythology in proper context. And so I'll provide you this information in order to assist you with maybe the completion of that discussion question, but also with understanding historically where our myths lie. I'll provide you some background based on what's written here on each of these ages, so again, so that you can understand how Greek culture was developing and get a better sense of where mythology proceeds as we go through these ages. Okay, so 5 ages that are given to you in the textbook, which I've also listed here, are Minoan, Mycenaean, Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. So I'll describe each of these in sequential order, providing some background as necessary to give you some additional perspective on how mythology develops in this world. Okay, so let's start with Minoan. As you probably could tell from the name, Minoan is named after the king of Crete, a very well-known named Minos. And Minos, from what we could tell, was the king who was credited with advancing the civilization on Crete to its greatest reach politically and militarily. It was under Minos that the Cretan civilization was able to develop probably one of the first major fleets that we have referred to in the Mediterranean world, and is able to expand its political supremacy over quite a few of the nearby islands, as well as Crete itself. And Minoan civilization appears not to have been troubled very much by warfare, because all of the Minoan settlements that we have, including most notably Knossos, but also some other ones like Palaikstra, for instance, do not have walls surrounding the cities. So apparently Crete itself was not troubled by outside invasion, from what we can tell, and there's no other evidence to suggest that it was. And so Minoan civilization lasted for quite a long time, apparently without too much disturbance, and with a relatively effective naval empire in place. Now, Minoan civilization dates back at least to somewhere in the 3000 to 2500 BC range, and it lasts all the way down until just about precisely the 1200s. Now, the way we could tell that is that Minoan civilization has quite a bit of architectural and artistic iconography that's taken from Eastern civilizations, most notably the bull metaphor. You will see in your Harris-Platzner textbook the famous bull riding and bull jumping fresco that shows the 2 athletes, one of them jumping on the bull and the other 2 on either side of it. So that shows that apparently that was a game with the bulls that the young athletes used to train in Minos. There's also quite a lot of bull symbolism in different places, suggesting the worship of that. And there are quite a few other goddess or godlike figures, like the famous snake lady, a copy of which is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, that suggests other forms of divine worship. So, there's quite a bit of mythology represented to us on Crete that appears to predate the standard Olympian pantheon-based mythology that we think of in later Greek mythology that we know best. And as we said, apparently this civilization lasted for quite a long time, relatively undisturbed. Now, we have documents surviving from Minoan civilization, but ones that are not really all that easy for us to translate. They are written interestingly, in a linear script that is very similar to the way that Greek or English today is written, where the letters are indeed written from left to right. That might not sound especially impressive until you realize that there are other scripts that do not follow that same pattern. There are ones, for instance, of course, that go up and down, like some of the Asian languages. There are other ones that also go across, but then turn around and go back the other way, and then turn around and go back the other way like this. And that's referred to as the boustrophodon script. And that name out of Greek means the turning of the ox. The ox will go down one side of the field and then turn around and come back down the other side like this as it plows. And so the type of writing that's used follows the track of the ox the very same way, and that's what that name refers to. So for linear A to be an actual line-by-line script like that is actually a very interesting development this early in Greek civilization. Now, as I say, we're not really able to translate linear A all that effectively, so we don't really know exactly what language it is. But it may have some relation to an early form of Greek, but it doesn't seem to have enough tie over to necessarily be related to it or for us to really be able to translate it. Okay, now Minoan civilization lasts until, as we said, until the 1200s BC. But the real cataclysmic event that brought the Minoan civilization effectively to its knees, although not actually enough to vanquish it, was this, the eruption of Thera. Now, on your Sakai workshop, you should find listed among the pages a website link for Secrets of the Dead, Sinking Atlantis. If you are in the summer course, there is actually an assignment related to that video. If you are in one of the school year courses, there's no actual assignment for that video, but it's still recommended that you do watch it. It's still provided for you so that you can view it. Sinking Atlantis refers to the tie-in between the loss of Minoan civilization and the destruction of the mythical island Atlantis, as described to us by the work of Plato, the later philosopher, called Timaeus. According to this, the populace of Atlantis became greedy and excessively warlike, and were eventually reduced to an underwater island with flooding and earthquakes by the gods attempting to punish them. It was thought for a long time that that was nothing more than a myth. However, the eruption of Thera, which is dated by ice rings in other parts of the world, like in Greenland, to 1400 BC, appears to have been at least 10 times the strength of later volcanoes better known, such as Krakatoa. It was an extraordinary event, and it appears to have spread ash in many, many different parts of the Greek world. However, for some period, it was thought that maybe Minoan civilization stopped right there when the island of Crete was covered by ash. It turns out, however, that the weather pattern does not support the ash to have actually landed on Crete in sufficient quantities to destroy the civilization. And there is still artwork and architecture dating subsequent to 1400 BC that still appears to be Minoan. So that theory by itself wasn't quite enough. However, what's described in the Sinking Atlantis video is that there apparently was a flood that struck the eastern portion of Crete that might very well have indeed been enough to weaken Minoan civilization enough so that then later the Mycenaean civilization, when they spread out of the southern part of mainland Greece, were eventually able to come into Crete, and because of course the Minoans didn't have any wall protection, the Mycenaeans just simply came in and took over the island completely. So that would have been made easier for the Mycenaeans to do if in fact the Minoans were greatly weakened by the incursion of the tsunami from Thera a couple of centuries before that. So that's the first portion of our historical division of the Minoan age, stretching down to around 1200 BC. The Mycenaean age is a somewhat younger one that is on mainland Greece. You can find on your map the city of Argos in the Peloponnesus, and Mycenae is located right near there. The Mycenaean city itself did not survive into classical Greece, but the city of Argos was built right there on the same site and became a very powerful city, starting in like the 700s, 600s BC and lasting all the way down through into Roman times. Mycenae itself, in its day before it fell off, was a very powerful city, strong enough itself to build up something of a mighty empire on mainland Greece. It's a city, of course, that's associated with King Agamemnon, the one who helped his brother Menelaus to lead the fleet of 1,000 ships against Troy after the kidnapping of Menelaus' wife Helen by the Trojan prince Paris. So Mycenae, of course, has that association. But Mycenae itself was, in fact, a very powerful city that spread its wealth and also its militant capacity all around mainland Greece, and then also was able to sail out as well. It happened that the ash and the floodwaters did not touch Mycenae, even though many other parts of Greece were affected. Mycenae was far enough in not to be flooded, and also was in the wrong direction for the ash to spread in that way. And so therefore, although quite a few places in Greece were adversely affected by the Theron volcano, Mycenae missed all of it, and therefore was one of the few survivors after the Theron volcano to be able to spread even further and take down the Minoan civilization. Mycenae, however, appears to have run afoul when they spread too far. Even though we do not know the exact circumstances of the Trojan War, as to how it relates to reality as opposed to what's described in the myths in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and other sources. It appears that there was some type of a conquest attempted by the mainland Greeks, including the Mycenaeans, against the Trojans in around the time 1200 to 1100 BC, when it was thought originally that war actually did happen. Troy itself was, together with Mycenae, were both excavated by the proto-archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann back in the 1800s. And although, unfortunately, Schliemann did a very poor job of actually conducting the archaeology and may have also been rather, let's say, fast and loose with his interpretation of evidence, he did launch the field of archaeology, which was presumably conducted with a lot more patience and talent by later archaeologists, such as, for instance, famously Carl Blegen, who went to Crete to excavate Knossos and the other Minoan sites. So what Schliemann was able to demonstrate, if it's maybe the wrong way in some cases, was that there had been a conflict between Troy and Mycenae of some type, although not likely of exactly the type that was described in the Trojan War. So whatever happened, though, it appears that the Mycenaean civilization did actually decline after 1200 BC or later, when the Trojan War would have happened. Apparently, they stretched themselves too far in conducting that campaign. We hear about these mysterious so-called sea peoples who circulate around this period, and several civilizations all at once. The Hittites, the dynasty in Egypt, and also the Mycenaeans all die off practically simultaneously with the incursion of these sea peoples. We don't know exactly who these sea peoples are, but they appear to have wrought considerable destruction in several parts of the ancient Mediterranean and Eastern worlds. And lost among the victims there were, in fact, the Mycenaeans in around the 1200 to 1100 BC period. By 1100 BC, the Mycenaeans were pretty much out of service. Okay, now the Mycenaeans are associated with Linear B. And Linear B has a certain infamy to it because it was thought, like the Linear A, also to be another one of these non-Greek linear alphabets, until it was discovered by a graduate student named Michael Ventris, who was himself assisted by some women students, that Linear B actually was Greek. When Michael Ventris wrote his dissertation, he was laughed at, and unfortunately he died quite young, not long after he published it. And then later scholars re-examined his evidence and discovered that he was actually right. So Linear B, unlike Linear A, is translatable and is in fact a form of Greek. We're actually surprisingly fortunate with Linear B due to an ancient accident. Linear B is preserved for us on these long clay tablets, and the only things that are described by, on Linear B are wares that were kept in various storehouses, like tripods, which was one of the key words that Michael Ventris used to compare it with later Greek and to realize that it actually was a Greek script. So tripods and pots and wine and so forth. And some of these tablets were kept in a storeroom in a palace in Pylos, which is over on the southwest corner of the Peloponnesus. You can look on your map. And there was a fire there. that may have been started by perhaps a lantern knocking over and setting on fire the wine or the olive oil possibly, or something else, and the palace actually burned down. When that happened, these clay tablets, which ordinarily would have been destroyed, were actually baked, and that led to an archaeological discovery of Linear B on clay, and eventually also in other locations as well. And it's those clay tablets that allowed us to first locate and then actually eventually translate Linear B to discover that the Mycenaeans actually did write in an early proto-form of Greek. So that was an extraordinary discovery to realize that the Greek went back that far. When we were able to translate it, we also discovered that many of the gods' names, such as Hermes, for instance, that we again associate with classical Greece, actually did already exist back in the Mycenaean world. So although our first actual piece of literature, the Iliad and Odyssey by Homer, are dated to Archaic age, there is in fact some evidence that suggests some of the gods referred to by Homer could have already existed back in the Mycenaean world, and therefore that the mythology that we have described to us by Homer was already several centuries old. So quite a bit of the mythology must have been transcribed orally, since we don't have any writing left over from the period in the form of literature, must have been transcribed orally from the early Minoan and Mycenaean days down to what's referred to as the Archaic age. And Linear B is the keystone that shows us that did actually happen, and that Greek was there in existence to allow that transmission to happen more capably. Okay, so we've now covered reasonably satisfactorily Minoan and Mycenaean periods, and now in the companion video to this one, coming right up, we're going to go into these periods, which are more relevant for the text that we're actually reading here in the course. So come on right back, and we will continue this survey of the ages.